Here's one of my other favorite reverbs in that same vintage vibe. It's also from Universal Audio. Let me pop it open here. I've got it saved it as a preset, like I mentioned up at the top here. When I click on that, it's going to show you those different presets. It automatically gives you a little check mark right there on the one that you've selected for that channel. So you don't even have to remember which one it is. Those are all the different presets I've saved. Here's the one I'm looking for. It's got a check on it for that channel. You just go down to that check, click it, and boom, it pops right there, right into my slot, and I can just double click and open that little guy. It doesn't look that big, it doesn't look that powerful, but this is a little beast of a chamber. These are the Capitol chambers from Universal Audio. One of the best sounding reverbs I've got. It's a little bit pricey from Universal Audio, as always, but wait for the sale, the semi-annual sale, or something like that, and you can get a good deal on it. If you do it right, you can get it for less than $100. I'll tell you a little bit more how I did that and how I always buy my plugins from Universal Audio to save, get the best, lowest prices on them, when to buy, and how to save an additional $25 every time you purchase a plugin from them. I hope they don't change that when they realize that I do this, but I'll tell you about it, and get in there while the going's good, because it's a good way to save money on these expensive plugins from Universal Audio. I think they're some of the best plugins I've got. I love them. I've invested heavily in Universal Audio and their line of plugins. And then more recently, some of their hardware. I'm starting to purchase some of the hardware from them as well, as we've talked about. But this particular one is an emulation of 4 of the different reverb chambers that they actually physically had underground in the Capitol Records building. They, of course, had a very early, nice recording studio on the first floor, and their executive offices on the floors all the way up to the top. I think there's 13 floors. The executive was on the 13th floor, but nobody called it that. They just called it the executive floor. In the basement, not even in the basement, these were under the parking lot. Before they built the building, they built these underground reverb chambers, and then they built the building on top of them. Back then, there were no rack mount devices like this. The only reverb they had was a physical room. The rooms that they recorded in, they could use for the natural reverb in that room. But if they wanted something bigger and a little bit longer, they used reverb chambers, which were just big empty rooms. Typically hard surfaces, very reflective concrete or painted concrete surfaces, no carpeting or anything like that. They would put a microphone, they would start with sending the signal down into the room through a cable, then went all the way down through the building into the chamber, or the chambers, they had several of them, into that room, and they would play the output from that source, that microphone or that track, through a speaker or a pair of speakers that were physically in the room, and it would blast out that sound into that reverberant chamber, okay? And then at the other end of the room, they would have a pair of microphones at the far end of the room, picking up, recording those speakers, and then that would go all the way back through the building, up through these long cables, back into the recording studio, where it would be added as an effects return, just like we do now with effects devices or with plugins. But back there, they actually had to have these chambers underground, and they sounded great. These were the early recordings made from guys like Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra. This was the sound that they used. They didn't have modern recording effects like we do now, so these reverb chambers were always in use from session to session, so they built several of them. I think they originally started with 4, and each of them was a little bit different, but they all had their own kind of character. So the engineer got to choose which chamber he liked, and then they could also actually send a technician down to the room, down the stairs, into the sub-basement or whatever, and he would walk into the chamber and reposition the microphones. If they wanted less reverb, they moved the microphones physically closer to the speakers so they didn't hear so much of the room. And the closer you got, the less reverb. That's how they controlled the length of the reverb. They obviously couldn't change the sound of the room, but they could change the position of those microphones in relation to the speakers. And it was a guy's job to go down there, and the engineer would say, hey, that reverb is too long, I want to shorten it up for Mr. Sinatra. The guy would go down and move the microphones closer to the speakers. They might even use a different type of microphone. It was really a fine science these guys had. They would change the microphones out for a different tonality of the room. They might even change the speakers. I think originally they used the same type of speakers that they used in movie theaters, early movie theaters, to blast out the audio to the audience. I can't remember the name of those speakers right now. I think they're made by Altec. Voice of the Theater, something like that. I'll list it down below. But they might even switch out those speakers if they wanted a different type of tone. The one consistent was the sound of the room. They really couldn't change that much. They were a very unusual shape, kind of like a pie shape. That's what they had for reverbs. I think later on in their history, they wanted to add more chambers. They were very popular. I think the Capitol Studios had more than one studio. So the Studio B or Studio C might want to use a reverb chamber, but Studio A might be booked. I mean, if Frank Sinatra is in Studio A and he wants to use reverb chamber number 2, you can bet that you're not going to get access to that reverb chamber. And Frank's locked in there. He's not going anywhere that week. So they wanted to have different chambers for the other studios to use, or just for a different tonality on that room. So they actually dug up the parking lot and put in 4 more chambers underground there, built 4 more chambers. So they had I think it was up to 8 different pie-shaped chambers down there, accessible by a long dark hallway and a ladder probably. Probably a fun, pretty place to be. I'll bet it was pretty dank and unpleasant, probably pretty hot, but eventually Capitol Records had access to 8 different chambers underground there. And now Universal Audio struck up a deal with Capitol to go in and basically take a sample of those rooms the same way you would take a sample of an instrument like a piano or a drum. You can also take a sample of a reverb. It is a noise, and you can capture that, and you can capture the room in several different positions. You can move the microphones. You can position those microphones differently and get different depths of the reverb. They really went in there and captured a very pristine set of samples to replicate or emulate. They didn't do all 8 chambers. They did 4 of them. They did Studio 2, 4, 6, and 7, which were, I guess, the favorite ones. And they've sampled each of those different rooms. And you can select the different rooms just like that. They've even got a nice little picture there what the room might have looked like. The speaker configuration, kind of cool. It's a very fun plug-in interface to play with. When you make adjustments, it's kind of cute. The little blinking light on the top of the Capitol Records building starts blinking to let you know that plug-in is being loaded. That's what's happening when you're loading that plug-in. It takes a while for it to load that big, nice chamber. And while it's doing that, the light is blinking on the top of the Capitol Records building, which I think is the cutest thing on any plug-in. Also, I'm not sure if you're seeing it here, but when you switch things like the microphones, they've showed 4 different microphone configurations here, in addition to their room sizes. I mean, the different chambers. You can select all the different vintage mics that they used down here, and those are stereo pairs. And those are all very expensive microphones, big old ribbon mics. I think they've got a pair of, looks like SM80s in there. Anyway, I won't go too much into that, but you've got 4 different stereo pairs of microphones that they use to get the sample. And when you change those mics, this is the other cutest thing I think I've ever seen on a plugin, is the little door opens up, as if there's a technician coming in to make those adjustments on the microphones. I thought that was a really nice touch. Whoever came up with that at Universal Audio should get a medal. And then when the microphone is changed, the little light on the top will stop blinking, and the door in a second here is going to close just like that. I guess the technician can go on his lunch break then. And they should have had a little guy that walks in and does it, but I guess that would require a cartoon or something. But anyway, the coolest thing about it, besides just having those 4 different chambers to choose from, is that you can use this simple slider here to change the position of the microphones. It opens up, they're all the way back in the room, but if you want to send your little virtual man down there, send him in, open the door, and he can move the microphones closer to the speakers for less of a reverb, or he can move them farther back to get the full reverb. Yeah, you can actually move that back and forth to, just like the guy would have done in the room. He would move the mics closer or further away. They even got a little X mark on the ground there, a tape mark, I guess, where that engineer marked that microphone. That's how exact these guys, they would put markings to know that Mr. Nat King Cole, he liked a shorter reverb, so they might put those here. Frank liked it wide open. Or you could just change to a different room entirely. Boom. It's nice as it stays on the microphone that you chose when you switch rooms. For example, if I chose these nice big ribbon microphones, when I switch to a different room, it stays on those mics. Let's see if the position changes, stays the same. I'm going to move the mics right up close to it. Let's see if I go to another room if the mics move back or they stay in place. Yeah, see, they stay right up close. Nice. And then if you move them back, when you switch to another room, they're still far back. Very nice, nicely thought out. So if you like a big, wide open reverb, the mic's all the way back in the room, and you just want to play with hear the different sounds on those rooms, you just click like that. Wait a second for the light to stop blinking, you know the plugin's loaded. And you're basically booking a session at Capitol Studios. The studio is still in business. It's doing great, and the chambers are still very much in demand. I'm not exactly sure how many of them there are, how many chambers are left, maybe 4. I'll find out for you. But I would love to go to LA someday and go down and see those chambers and just hear what they sound like. But until I do that, I've got the sound of those reverbs, those chambers right here at my fingertips. Down below here, you've got some settings you can adjust. Probably the most important one is going to be down here at the bottom. It's a mix knob right there where you can control how much dry signal you want all the way up to 100% wet. 15% is in the middle. It's not 50%. It's an interesting number they chose. The default middle setting mix is about 15% reverb. So you would have 85% dry vocal, for example, and 15% reverb would be right up the middle instead of 50%. Over here, the width of the reverb, I guess that's the space between the microphones. That's my guess there. It doesn't virtually move the microphones apart, but that's the width of the room, I believe. How much stereo spread is on that? I guess 0 would be mono, 100 would be wide open, 50% somewhere in the middle. I'm going to look into that a little bit more. And then just some basic EQ settings right here. They're not parametric. These are all fixed frequencies. At the beginning there, you've got a high-pass filter, or also call that a low cut to avoid confusion, but that's going to roll off low end. If you've got rumble or something like that, you can roll off the low end and just leave the highs. Very nice. And then here you've got 3 EQ volume attenuators right there, one at 5 kilohertz, 500 hertz, and 125 hertz. I guess those are just very nice EQs for that particular reverb or those chambers. Those are probably the selections you had on the original chambers, just those 5 basic, they could have given you a full parametric EQ or something like that. But my guess is that they're just giving you exactly what the engineer had access to. Probably at the console, I'm not sure. That would be from the send or the return. But anyway, they were able to EQ the signal from that, either to or from that reverb chamber right there. They could equalize a little bit more to really dial in the frequency of that reverb they wanted. And then at the top, you've got pre-delay. I almost always use it with no pre-delay, but if you wanted a little bit of a delay before that reverb kicked in. You could do that for some interesting effects. And then the actual decay of the reverb right there, minimum, mid, or max. A little bit unclear, to be honest, about the difference between that decay and the space of the microphones going back and forth in the room. I'm going to look into that a little bit more and find out what the difference between the decay length and the length of the mics from the source. This switch here is obviously a power switch that shuts everything down. Just like the bypass wheel up here, that'll bypass everything. But if you want to see it happen, you can just turn it off, and that's no effect. Down here, this button is kind of important. If you're using this as a send return like I am here, that is, I'm not dropping this plug-in in on a track, I'm using it in my send and returns section here on the very end, which basically turns it into 100% wet. I hope that's clear, but typically when you have a reverb like I did over here, you want those to be 100% wet or affected, and you're sending the signal you're sending to it is going to determine how much of that reverb is hitting that send is hitting that reverb, and then you can adjust it also on the return faders on your mixing board, how much of that reverb you want. They're just assuming you want 100% of that reverb all the time. If you're dropping it in on a track, individual track, say a lead vocal, and you just want to have that one chamber just on your lead vocal, you don't have to mess around with the send and returns like I have set up here. You could just have it just for that one track, and then adjust how much of that mix. You would turn off the wet solo right here and adjust how much of that you wanted. If you wanted the dry signal, you would do that. If you want 100% of the chamber, no drag signal, or if you wanted it more conservatively at around 15% like they suggest there, you could do that. But the one thing about this Capital Chambers is it is kind of a memory hog. It takes up a lot of RAM, or it takes up a lot of the CPU power in your Apollo device. It actually doesn't take up RAM, it takes up the memory in your Apollo device, and there's a limit to how many effects you can have. You can't just open up 10 of these because you're going to use up all of the memory in your Apollo device. There's ways you can get around that by purchasing satellite memory and stuff like that. I don't have anything like that. I just keep an eye on my memory bar for my Apollo device. I've got it separate from my my computer's DAW, which has a memory setting. I mean, it shows me how much memory I'm using right there. I usually just park it over here as an effects return, and I never leave it open unless I'm using it because it uses a lot of CPU power for the Apollo. So I'll bypass it until I need it, and or not even open it. If I don't need it, I'm not using up any RAM at all by not having it open, but I can easily access it like I showed you before by just clicking there. It loads, and then boom, it's ready to go. And you can also keep it parked in the chamber that you normally want, like that. You know, if you like chamber 6, you can have it preloaded, so when you open it up here, it's going to go boom right to chamber 6. All your settings, everything can be saved as a preset there. The last thing I'll show you about the Apollo Capital Chambers reverbs is that they've got some nice presets here, right there. Click down, and they've got a whole bunch of different famous producers and engineers, and the choices that they've made using different rooms and different settings on those different rooms. Al Schmidt is a famous engineer and producer that worked at Capitol Records for a long time. He has a huge history there. He did a lot of the early big bands and things like that there. Apparently, he always liked Chamber 4. So when I click on Al Schmidt, it's called The One. It's the one chamber he liked the best. It's not Chamber 1, it's the one he liked. And that happened to be Chamber 4. And you can see exactly the type of microphone, the SM80 he liked. He liked that 15% setting. You know, it doesn't look like he EQ'd it or anything. But anyway, that's when Al chooses the reverb chamber. That's the one he likes, chamber 4 with those settings. There's other engineers there that have their different favorites and different versions. There's a big vocal. There's all kinds of them here, and it's really nice because you can run a signal through it like a vocal and just click around until you hear, you know, it might say drums, but it might sound great on your horn, you know, and it's great to just listen to the different engineers' choices. There's a Frank Filippetti snare drum sound, great for, you know, that big chamber snare sound. Looks like he used chamber number 6, and anyway, fantastic collection from Capitals. Close that. If you've enjoyed this, maybe give me a quick little like, a thumbs up, and if you've really enjoyed it, hit the subscribe button. It helps me out a lot. If you want to purchase any of these plugins or products, look in the comment section down below and hit show more, and I've got some links to some of these. You can purchase them directly online, and you'll have them tonight. You don't have to mess around. You'll have them in your computer tonight. And like I said, always check out for the sales prices. You don't want to be paying full price for these plugins. All right. Aloha.